Good morning, lovely people. Yes. Okay, so this is the second session in our quest to build a single-page application and consume the web services for the purpose of building a web app that we can embed into Linux.net. Okay, so we're taking the application we already have built. This purely JavaScript, doesn't actually use any server-side stuff. And we extending that, building a web API on top of it, so we can actually get some data out of a database, or in our case, we're going to be getting data out of Linux.net through the web API. All right, so what we're going to do in this session is we're going to add server-side services to our application and consume those services from AngularJS single-page application. Okay, so within that scope, what we're going to do is we're going to create web API controllers within MVC scope, and implement HttpGet and HttpPost on those controllers, create some user interface to show the user that we are querying some data from web service, so that we can see a little waiting sign on it, and do some error handling from the web API. Obviously, our web API can fail at any point. For example, we can connect to the database, and we need to show that error, handled error, to the user interface, and maybe save that error in some log files. Okay, so let's start our application. Just have a look at what we are trying to do. So this is the application we've built in the last session. It's purely JavaScript. The data for this grid is actually coming from the JavaScript itself. We're not actually getting it from the database or anything like that. Also, the data for this drop-down box, this is the list of our locations, also coming directly from the JavaScript. So what we want to do is we want to actually get this data from, let's say, a database, or in our case, we're going to be getting that from Linux.net. What we need is, obviously, JavaScript cannot talk to the database directly. It can talk to Linux.net by API, but it's a little bit difficult to do, to sort of get JavaScript to talk directly to Linux.net. It's much easier to create something in the middle that has got a lot more functionality. That's actually going to be sitting on the server side, and that will be getting this data out of Linux.net, converting that into something we can easily use in our web application. All right, let me just start another project just to show you the final result, what we're trying to achieve. I think it's this one. Okay, final result. Let's hope my computer is going to work a little faster than last time. Okay, so this is pretty much what we're trying to do. As you can see, if I refresh this page, we see this waiting sign there, and this waiting glyph, is it called glyph, on our grid. So every time I refresh the page, now instead of getting this data from the JavaScript, sort of hard-coded data, we're actually making a request to the web service. That web service generates that data, returns it to us. And while it's happening, we also have this waiting sign on our grid as well. So ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. Okay, let's get to it. I'm going to close my existing application and going to jump to what we have built before. All right. So first of all, let's implement a web API controller. So MVC gives us a very easy way, well, provides a very, very easy way to create a web API. Because all the web API routing is already in there. It's got the automatic serialization of the data into JSON and all of these wonderful things that are already there. We don't need to concern ourselves with all this coding of those web services. Also, it creates a very easy way to create a RESTful API. RESTful API is where we have read, update, and delete commands directly. But we're not going to build our application in that specific manner, although it's a really good kind of design pattern for the web API. But again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a very easy to manage self-contained application just to display some data, etc. I'm not worried too much about scalability of it or support of this application by some other developers. Therefore, I'm just going to create a web service that has got a method, give me the list of locations, and gives me a list of locations. I have just a code behind methods. All right. So first of all, if we look at our MVC controllers there, what I can do is I can go and add I need to stop this. The execution first before I can add any controllers. If I add new controller, I have a list of, I have two different controllers that I can actually add. I can add MVC controller that is for our UI stuff. We don't want that. What we want is a WebAPI 2 controller and just basically an empty one. Let's go and create that one. And I'm going to call this locations controller. And that's going to be to get a list of our locations in that drop-down box. Okay, so it creates an empty class for me. This class inherits from API controller. That's an important thing to do because that tells our MVC that this is a web API controller. So all the routing, I'm going to show you how MVC actually routes this request to this API controller. We can redefine how it routes it in a file called WebAPI config, but we'll get to that in a second. All right, so I've got the API controller, and what I need to do now is actually create a method for it. I'm going to go and grab this code. I'm just going to walk you through it instead of just typing all of that stuff in. And another thing I need is, all right, let's just go through this first. So I've created a method. I called it getLocations, and I marked this method as get HttpGet. Therefore, I'm not going to be posting any data into this method. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to request this by the URL, and it gets me a list of classes. It's going to get me a list of classes of this specific type, so models location. I haven't actually defined this class, that's why it's showing me all these errors. So let's go and create this models locations class. New item. It's going to be just a code. Locations. I've got code for it as well. So effectively, this is just a data structure that I want, just a list of locations. In that class that I'm going to be returning, we're going to have location ID and a location name. That's all we need for that list of locations. Okay, and because our scope at the moment is just create a web service that we can consume from the from the AngularJS application. Therefore, I'm not going to talk to the database, or I'm not going to get this data out of Linux.net Web API. I'm just going to pre-populate it with some data on our server side instead of the client side. Okay, so effectively, I'm just going to create a list of locations. I'm going to stick some data into it. So warehouse 1, 2, and some East Asia. I'm going to return this list of locations. All right, so effectively, that's it. That's how we can create a web API method. All right, and if we go into web API config file in our MVC application, you can see it's got a routing definition. So effectively, one of the routes that it's got defined is a default API route that will, in our URL, will detect when it's got API. It will route everything to a API controllers, then a controller name, and then instead of this ID, I'm going to put action. So action is the actual method name that we're going to be executing. So every time we put in our URL API, then the name of the controller is going to be locations without the controller bit, and then action name, which is going to be, let's say, get location. This method will get executed, and we're going to get a list of our locations. So let's set a breakpoint here, execute this. All right, I'm going to clear all of that stuff off the URL. I'm going to put API locations. I think the method name was get locations. You can see that once I actually entered that URL, MVC routed this call to this controller, executed this method. It knows that it's HttpGet, so it knows how to construct the response. It knows that I don't have any parameters being fed into this method, and it just basically executes it. So effectively, now let's just go. Okay, apparently I can't use F10, so every time I try to sort of point my finger at the keyboard, stop me. Alright, this is step over. Okay, so we're just going to go through this, and you see we just stuck some elements into our locations, and we now have 3 elements in there, and I'm just going to go and execute this at the end. So you can see that we now have XML that's been returned from our web API. Effectively, we can take this XML, we can consume it from the web services. Obviously, it's much easier to communicate things in JSON between AngularJS and web API. And MVC has got a very useful thing. It can actually render the data in 2 different ways. I think even 3 or 4 different ways. It's all data, JSON, XML, whatever. Our AngularJS is actually automatically will request the data in JSON in any way. But if we just made it call directly to the web API, we'll get the data in XML. We can stick the data format, the content type in our header, and request a JSON from it. Okay, so so we now have a web API method. We can get a list of locations. What we need to do now is to consume this web service method from AngularJS. We need to do some changes in AngularJS application to implement a service consumption. Okay, so what we're going to do is just going to include this. Okay, so what we're going to do is in SPA, this is single page application. This is where I have all my code for my client-side stuff. I'm going to create a new class, new JavaScript. I'm going to API service. And for the simplicity of it, I'm just going to go and grab the code from here, and I'm going to walk you through that code as well. Okay, so it's a JavaScript function called API service, and effectively it takes a parameter $HTTP. $HTTP is the thing that sits within AngularJS that allows us to make a web API calls very easily. In fact, it makes it allows us to make any HTTP requests to anything very, very easily from AngularJS. And within that function, we have 2 methods. Let's put it this way. So if you think about this in a normal programming terms, API service is a class, and within that class we have two different methods: get API call and post API call. And effectively, it'll take a controller name. So this is our API / controller name / method name, and then the callback is effectively an event that will get fired after the execution is finished. Effectively, AngularJS, the HTTP thing, is a synchronous process. So whenever we called it from our application, it'll happen asynchronously. Asynchronously means that the application is not going to stop executing. It's just going to make that call. The new thread will be created. I don't know how the JavaScript will actually handle this, but effectively, in programming terms, if you think about it, the new thread will be created. It will start talking to the web service. This communication might take like a couple of seconds, for example, to finish, because on the web service we have to connect to the database, have to get the data. That will take some time. And then once that execution finished, once we got the data, we will be able to call this callback method. And then within this callback method, as you can see, the result, which is going to get HttpGet, then API controller name, the method, and on success we're going to call this function. On error we're going to call this function.
So effectively, on success, we're going to take the data that we received from the web API and its status, and we're just going to basically stick it in a local variable, and basically output this variable back through the event in our callback. More or less clear? I think if I actually step through it, it'll make it much simpler to understand. The same happens in the post API call. The only difference is that now I also supply a object as a parameter, because that's the object that I'm actually going to be posting to the web service. But we'll look at post API call as well. At the moment, we're just concerned with get API call, well, which is HttpGet method. All right, so I've defined my API services. Now what I need to do is I need to go and make some changes in the application. Effectively, I need to, now I've created the service, I need to tell our MVC runner, our AngularJS application, that there is a service that allows us to do HTTP requests. Okay, and I do that by copying some data from our Notepad, ++. Okay. So I declare that there is a API service by basically sticking that into services in our AngularJS application. I'll call it API. This is just some stuff I have to put in. This is basically an injection of HTTP from AngularJS, and effectively I'll pass in a function that will act as that service into it. Okay, obviously that I've now created this API service. What I need to do now, before it even works, I have to actually load it in my main index.html. It's going to sit in spa API services. Let's put it in the right place. I'm just going to go there. Okay. As I mentioned before, simply because we write in a very easy to manage self-contained application, I don't have to worry about loading these JavaScripts dynamically and things like that. But normally, when the application is bigger, obviously you don't want to declare all of the code of the whole application in your main HTML file, so that the client side doesn't load all those JavaScripts straight away. So you would use something like, do you know what Linux.net uses to load JavaScripts dynamically? Anybody? No? Basically, there's many different libraries that allow you to load JavaScripts dynamically as and when you need them. And in a more scalable application, you would use exactly that. When you need something, you only load it into the scope. In our case, it's all very simple. We just load everything that we need straight away. Okay, so we've done that. We created the API service. We added that API service to our application, AngularJS application. We loaded the JavaScript, and that's about it. So now let's go and make a change to our main controller. Just to reiterate this, if we look at our index.html, where's our index.html? So this is the application, this is the user interface that gets loaded. It's got that bar at the top, remember, where our drop-down box. Our drop-down box is right here, and it is bound to a selected location variable within our scope from the last session. And effectively, we've got this ngView that renders the grid. Okay, so what we want to do is, so it basically, and the actual drop-down list of items coming from models location from our main controller. You can see that this controller is main controller, and within that main control we have models. We've got locations within that model that contains an array of our locations. So let's look at our main controller, and this is where that model is being declared effectively. So scope, model, locations, and this is where I hard-coded my locations. list of locations. I'm going to delete that because we're going to be getting this from the web services. And I need to do something else. I forgot what. We've done that. Okay, let's do this. So by default, I'm going to have nothing selected, no location selected. That is the same. Okay, and we're now going to implement a function. It's called getLocations. So effectively, instead of hard coding this stuff in, I'm going to create a function that will request this from the web API. Now, we effectively, in this controller, main controller, we need to pass in the service that we're going to be using. So in our application, we've got the API service declared. But for every single controller, we have to inject that service into it. And we do this very easily by sticking the variable that, well, they're sticking the parameter that is being accepted by this main controller. And in the injection, we just stick the fact that we're going to pass in, we're going to inject an API controller, well, API service from our application into this. And we will have it accessible within this controller. So our getLocation method will use API that we declared. This is service. It will call this getAPI method within it, pass in the fact that we want locations controller and method getLocations. And as an event that gets fired after we got the data is going to be a function. Alright, and if there are no errors, okay, if there are errors, we're just going to just display an alert on the top of the page. It's going to come up with, hey, there's an error. And if there are no errors, then scope models locations will be the result of our API call. And effectively, there's more. If there are some locations being returned from the web service, we want to set it as a default selected location. Simple as that. Okay. So I think that should work now. Let's execute it and see. Okay, it's a really good idea when you're working with the web API, especially in Chrome, is to enable developer mode. I'm going to try to click F12 and hope that screen recording is not going to do anything. Okay, cool. The reason why we want to open the developer tools is so that we can see any console errors being thrown. We can also monitor what's being communicated with the web service. And most importantly, where is it? Ah, yes, we need to disable cache. So if we don't disable cache, then the web browser will cache the script that you had there before, and the code that you put in place might not actually be in place. So you wrote something, then you're trying to make sure it runs, and it doesn't, and you get confused. So just basically always open these developer tools just for the sake of it, so we never use any cache. All right, I think it worked. No, it didn't. As you can see, this is a really good example. First time I opened up this application, it actually worked. It displayed something, but in fact, because it was using the JavaScripts that were cached there before, so now that I've disabled the cache, it doesn't work. So we can go into console and see what is the problem. So cannot read property location from get data. In grid controller, do we care about that? We don't really. So why are you failing? I did. Get locations is being called. I think it's our get controller is trying to get some data from locations where there is no data to select. So I'm going to comment this out so we don't get the error. I'm going to comment the watch out as well, because we'll come to that later on. Let's see that it works. I've got no console errors, but I don't have anything in my list of locations. Okay, fair enough. And let's go and debug what's going on. All right, we can do that in sources. We've got our scripts loaded. I'm going to find the controller, main controller, stick a breakpoint here. Okay. Also, what I want to do is to set a breakpoint on our locations method there, just to make sure that it gets executed as well. And let's try it again. All right, I can see that it gets hit. So it goes into this get call API. I'm going to set the breakpoint there as well, and there. So when we get the response from the web service, we're going to check whether we have any errors, and also we're going to check, we're going to set the breakpoint if there's a successful execution, and see what we actually get from the web service. Yeah, we can see that our web method is being hit. Let's continue that. Okay, and we also now hit the breakpoint where it actually got the data from, web API. And if I look at the result as well, we can see that it's a list of 3 objects, all good. Those objects contain location ID, location name, it's all good, all right. Let's untick those breakpoints. And then I can't use F10. If the location, if location's length is more than 0, then we set the default location, and it's all good. All right. So why is it not displaying? I know why. Because in main index.html, okay, there's probably, most likely, cause for the fact that it doesn't display is because we have a crappy binding. In fact, yes, that's true. So yes, it should be location name. That's what we called it in there. So, and the drop-down itself is for all the locations, display X location name. Yay! We have the list now. Alright, and this list is actually coming from the web service now. It's not hard-coded, it's coming from the web service. Alright, so that's done. That's a very basic communication with the web service that we've implemented. Now let's extend this a little bit more and actually look at HttpPost as well. What I want to do is whenever we change the location, or whenever we change the page, or whenever we first loaded those locations, we need to get the list of low stock levels from Linux.net or from the database, whatever. It's basically we're going to use the web method on the that sits on the server to get this data. And for that we're going to use HttpPost method, because not only in that post method, the reason why we're using post method is because it's going to take some parameters in. It's going to take location ID that we've selected in. Okay, so first of all, I think I need another controller. Obviously, I can go and stick in more methods into this controller, but because this is basically our, it's a different scope of a controller. So what I want to do is to separate my scope of all those controllers into separate controllers, effectively. I'm going to go and create a new controller. Again, new an empty API controller, and I'm supposed to call it something specific. Stock queries. Stock query controller. Okay, so this is a controller where we know that all the methods in there are going to be to do with querying the stock levels. And okay, where's my notepad? Again, I'm just going to go and grab some code, stick it in there, and I'm going to start walking you through this code and add in some more classes and things like that we need. Okay, so created a new method, called this method getLowStockLevel, and I marked this as a HttpPost and also gave it an action name as well. We don't need to do that, because if your action name is exactly the same, then MVC would know that that's your action name. But if you want to call it something different, you can. Yep, and then your action name would be that instead of this. Alright, and this call effectively returns a get low stock level response and takes get low stock level request. Effectively, and the easiest way in MVC, so you don't have to dig around with the routings, is to take a single parameter in. Right? It's a very simple thing to do. And this parameter would be your class that contains a lot more other parameters and things like that. And that's why we kind of wrap everything. I tend to write everything, wrap everything within request and response as well. Within that response, we can have many different lists, some other variables, some other properties, etc. You know, the data that we need, single output, single class. And right, so let's go and define what we're actually gonna request first, and what we're actually gonna return in a response there. So request, this is going to be this. It's a class. In the request, we need location ID. This is the thing that we selected in drop-down box. Which page number we are currently on, and number of entries, number of records per page. Okay. So this is so that we can select a specific page in our grid. And in the response, we're going to return how many in total items we actually have to return, so that we can construct that paging correctly. And we're going to return a list of stock items. So this is each row, effectively. So obviously I need to create the class that will represent our row. And again, I'm going to go into models and put a new class in there. Call it stock level item, and instead of type in, I'll copy and paste. But as you can see, this is stock level item that will represent each single row. It's got the SKU, product title, number of items on order, due date, due quantity, and stock level, and the actual location name as well. So we've got that. Let's go back to our stock query controller, and that's about it. Now it will compile, and effectively what's that going to do? It will take the request, which will define which location ID you actually want to get the stock levels for, what page number we are on, and how many records we want per this request. And effectively this code here is just, I'm going to go and from the locations controller, going to get the list of our locations. Then we'll select the location that we specify, location ID that we specified in the request, and obviously that will be coming from your data adapter if you are connecting to the database or things like that. You get the idea. And effectively, instead of making the request to the database, again, I'm just going to put all of this data, generate this data on my server side, effectively. But of course, when you actually working properly, well, when we created the whole consumption of the web services from Linux.net, or where we connected our application to the database itself, of course that will be coming from the database. Okay, but in my case, I'm just going to generate them statically, effectively. I'm going to stick them in the response. So total items are just going to hard code in. There are 762 in total items, and put our page, well, number of items that we can see on the page into the rows, effectively in the response, and that's the data we're going to get back from the web service. Right, so we've got another API controller with a method called get low stock level that would take a request that will where we specify our location ID, and we're going to get a response back that will have all the rows in there and number of items that totally exist in the database. We've got that. All right. So now we need to go and change our. This is that I don't have on the notes, so therefore I have to kind of remember what I have to do now. So bear with me. Right, in the grid controller, we're going to have to change this method,
how we get the data from the database. Okay, so this get data at the moment, it just empties everything we currently have in our selected data and just generates them statically on the client side. Obviously, we want to replace that with a request to the web service. So first of all, I'm going to go and change our default low stock level data that we bound to the paging controller and to the grid itself. I'm going to say that we currently have no items, we don't know anything about anything. This remains the same. Okay, I'm just going to go and replace this with some code. I'm just going to walk you through this code again. Okay, so pretty much exactly the same. I'm going to empty what we currently have, and then I will construct a request. So effectively, I'm just going to construct a class. And in JavaScript, it's all very easy. We don't have to actually declare a class. I'm just going to create a data structure where we have location ID equals the location ID we have selected in the drop-down list. Page number is going to be the page number from our scope, low stock data, current page. Remember that in the previous example, we bound our paging controller to our data, low stock data, and then current page. So whenever we change the page, this thing will change. So we don't have to worry about actually getting this parameter from the paging controller. And entries per page is going to be taken from pretty much exactly the same class from there, items per page, so 10. Whenever I change it to 20, it will automatically change to 20. And then instead of using a get method from the API, we're going to be using post method, post API call, which reminds me that we don't actually have the API declared in our grid controller, so we haven't injected that yet. Let's do that, otherwise it won't work. Declare that as a parameter, and also going to go and inject it into our controller. Okay, so now that we have it, again, we're going to create a constructor, and finally there, on successful, let's go back to this one actually, post API, stock query, get low stock level, we'll pass in the request that we declared in there, where we have selected location and all that kind of stuff. Then we'll pass the callback event. We're going to check what we kind of returned in that event, so what's been returned from the web service. If the event has no errors, then we're going to take the data that we have returned from the result, dot rows, right? Come back to our stock controller. This is the class that we're returning, and within that class we have rows. So it's very easy to bind things in the AngularJS, because we don't have to worry about the casting different classes into different things. It's all very cowboyish, Wild West. Just dot something and it works, or it doesn't. Okay, so result rows is going to be our data rows. Result dot total items. Again, total items. This is going to be the number of total items we have. Okay, and I know that it will fail. And the reason why it will fail, I'll show you why it will fail actually. So I'm going to go and uncheck that. And we can uncomment this code as well. Alright, so when we load this grid controller, we're going to go through some definitions, we're going to declare a function, and then at some point we're going to call get data. So as soon as we hit that controller, we want to get the data. Obviously, when we get this data, we're going to have no location ID. We haven't actually got it from the web services yet. Okay, just to demonstrate what it's going to look like. Let's execute it and see it's failing miserably. Again, what do I have to do? I have to click F12 for it not to work. Hey, it worked. Ah, crap. Why did it work? It shouldn't have worked. I was trying to make it not work. Stop working! Alright, so we're hitting this data.
Okay, it works because we're getting the data very, very fast from the web service. But if we've got any delays, then this will stop working. In fact, why are you working?
Throw sleep on locations.
Yes, we're going to do that. Okay. Don't want to stop the whole thing. Just want to make it. I just want to make it a little slower, right? So that's what we as programmers like to do. We've got a perfectly working application. We're going to go, hey, I think it's too fast. Let's make it slow. So that we can then make it fast, and all the users go, thanks for doing all this cool work. Now it's so much faster. There you go. All right. So now we refresh, and because there's a delay between getting the list of locations and loading this controller, when we hit when we hit this get data, the grid, this controller loads up. It straight away calls get data, which hits this thing. And once we're in it, can't use F10, can't use F10, can't use F10. Oh my god. Step out. Again, and again, and again. Oh crap. So you start again. Alright, so we're there. As you can see, location ID is going to be nothing. Selected location is null. Therefore, whenever we generate this request, we'll yield this object location ID is undefined. Okay? That's because we haven't actually loaded the new locations yet. So it's what we can expect from the web service. You know, there's always a delay between one call and another one firing. So we always have to code for it. All right. So the way we can code for it, first of all, what I need to do is to make sure that we never fail. Okay, and we can easily check if our location is actually defined in the first place. So if we've got something selected in the first place, then we've got some data. Also, I don't actually need get data anymore. Right? I can delete that because we've got a watch. Whenever the selected location variable within our scope changes, we're automatically going to fire up that get data call, that get data method. Okay. So now, basically, our main controller will send a request to the web API to get a list of locations. The grid controller will do nothing. They're just going to load up. Then, whenever we've got a response back, we're going to select a location. We're going to set the selected location in the scope. AngularJS will detect that it's changed, and we'll call this function automatically. And just for the sake of it, we also put a little check there, just in case somebody else will go, oh, don't get any data, so we'll go and get the data, or a client or a user did some action and it did fire that method. We also put this check in place. The fact that we definitely know that there is a selected location. Refresh. Yay! Now you can see it's kind of, we've got a workflow. Send a request to the web service, waited for that response, and then we went into the method that actually gets the data from the web service. And just to prove that it does get the data from the web service, I'm going to go into network and refresh it. And we can see there is a call there, get low stock level, right there. And this is the request that this is request, this is response. This is the request payload. As you can see, we've sent entries per page, 10, location ID that's selected in there, 1, page number is 1. And we've got the response, which is a JSON that effectively represents the class, this get stock level response. We've got number of total items and rows as an array. Okay, let's refresh that again, and just to marvel at our wonderful piece of work. So paging also works, as you can see. Now I'm changing something. The page number actually changes. It produces different list of items. If I change my location as well, it also sends that to the web service. The web service sticks that in the response, and we've got the currently selected warehouse as well. Alright, so let's do some slowing down, because we like to slow things down as well. Do you remember we have to make it appear to the user that it was very slow to begin with, and then we made it faster. So on here I'm going to set a breakpoint whenever we change the page. We're trying to get the data from the web service, and here we're going to say system threading sleep for a bit. This current thread, and sleep for a whole 1,000 milliseconds, just to make it let's make it 2,000 milliseconds to make it really, really annoying. All right. Nothing happening. Oh, it did. Huh? Nothing happening. Oh my god. It doesn't work. Oh no, it does. Yeah, really annoying, right, for the user. I mean, something is happening. They don't know what's happening. All right. For that, on the web application, it's really good to show that your application is actually communicating with the web service. And we can go into this UX discussion about exactly how we're going to display the fact that there's something happening, whether we're going to gray out the whole application, say we're working, whether we're going to preload everything and then enable the application, or disable every single element on our page that is actually doing some work. Which can also be very annoying when we've got lots of different things and you can see this loading screen everywhere, and your whole thing is just spinning around, and you go, what the hell is happening? And so again, but in our for this specific purpose, what I want to do is to stick that loading. What do you call that thing? I called it a spinny thing. Spinny thing. It doesn't have a name. It's just a spinny thing. I want to put it on the component that we're actually loading. So whenever we load in this list of warehouses, I want to stick a little thing there. Now we do this. We do this by going to Google and looking for a spinny thing for AngularJS and finding lots of different libraries. I found a library. Where's our spinny thing? Yes, I'm busy. It's there. I think it's called loading overlay for AngularJS. If you go to Google and type something like that, you'll see a GitHub source code for it. Just download that JavaScript and stick it in your application. So effectively, I already downloaded that and stuck it into scripts. So I'm just going to go and load it into our application. Right, so the spinny thing will go in, and also that spinny thing will need the actual thing that spins. I love my language. Anyway, we need an icon that actually spins. The best thing for any kind of icons that you want to use on your application is Font Awesome. It's really easy to use. All you need to do is just to reference it in as a CSS, and go to Google and search Font Awesome. There's lots of different icons, and effectively what that overlay, loading overlay does, it basically extends your functions within JavaScript that finds an element, makes it disabled, so it puts like a div over it, and then sticks that Font Awesome spinning thing, and then rotates it all the time. That's all it does. Okay, so I referenced that script. I also referenced my CSS, so I'll get nice icons everywhere. And so I've done that. Go to application, and we're actually going to declare a method that's going to be available to every controller. And that's what I do, is I'm just going to declare it in the application itself. So just a method called setBusy that will take an element, and this element I can use AngularJS to find that element on my DOM, or I can use jQuery to find that element on the DOM. There are like sayings on the internet when I was looking for things. that says if you use AngularJS, forget about jQuery altogether. It's a really good advice, but sometimes quite impractical. For finding things on a DOM, jQuery is awesome because you just got like $sign and then you find the element. You can do the same thing with Angular actually, but you kind of got used to using jQuery a lot. Anyway, what am I talking about? So we've got this function called setBusy. So whenever I call this function setBusy, give it an element, and hide means that I want to hide the setBusy status, or I want to show it as a true and false. And set is just going to make my controller, well, put that spinny thing on my controller. Alright, so in the main controller, when before I start getting any data, before I make this call, I'm going to set busy, then the element that I want to set busy to, okay? So I need to go and find this element in my DOM. The way we search for elements on the DOM, it's a matter of huge discussion whether we should do this thing or not. Lots of people, like lots of people who work on larger systems, larger web applications, would say, no, do not use IDs, never. It's awful. You can't have more than one ID on your page. It's gonna fail. Who cares? It's a small application. I'm the only developer for it, so screw it. I'm gonna use IDs. Obviously, the recommended way of doing this is by using class names instead for searches. So I can actually put any class in here, any class name that doesn't, I can't do that, doesn't exist. Alright, and I can use jQuery and find an element by this class name instead. Because it doesn't exist, it doesn't make any difference, and it just tags this element as that. But I like to use IDs. Where was I? Main controller, okay. So I'm going to find this element by its ID, which means I have to do this. I'm going to use jQuery to do that, and I will take this element and send it to this setBusy function that will set a spinny thing on it. Alright, and after I finish, so after I've got a response from the get API, this event will get fired, well, this function will get fired up, okay? And within it, straight away, I want to set it to, oh, it's not busy anymore. And let's execute it. Yay! You see that? Spinny thing is working. Sort of. We don't see it very clearly because what we need to do is to make it even slower. Then 5 seconds to get any data. Now we know that something is happening, something is working, okay? We're going to do the same thing for, why are we trying to get this again? Okay, 1 second is enough. We can do the same thing for grid controller again. So before we get the data, let's actually tag our grid. So the whole thing, I will tag ID equals grid. This is low stock level grid. Set busy. Ding. And then finally, when we've got, oh, actually, I want to do that only if we actually execute this just before we make the call, right there. Otherwise, it'll set it to busy. We don't have anything to load. It'll leave it as busy. Alright, so just before we make the call, we'll set it to busy, and once we got the response back, we'll set it to not busy. True. Loading. Didn't work. Why don't you work?
hash for the ID?
I am using hash for the ID. It doesn't work. Oh, that's why it doesn't work. I haven't actually saved the thing. Okay. Yeah, so now we've got that spinny thing on the grid as well to show the user that we're actually doing something. Easy. Alright, next. Obviously, we don't write code that is bug-free. There will be some errors coming from the web API. So we can have something in here that we messed up the database connection, or we implemented null reference exception. Let's implement the null reference exception actually. So I'm going to go list of things equals nothing, and then I'm going to go find element in it. So that's our lovely null reference exception that we always implement. Are you kidding me?
You have to set it to null, otherwise it's undefined.
Yeah, but Visual Studio, I know it doesn't know about it. Ah, you stupid Visual Studio. Okay, so this is the very common way, null reference exception everywhere there. We've got it everywhere, especially when we use link, they're absolutely everywhere. So, execute that, and we've got an error on the actual web API. That's fine, it's an unhandled error, which means that we're just going to throw an exception. And we've got that exception, and we're showing, what are we showing? We're going to show just an alert saying there's an error somewhere. Error code is 500, internal server error. And that's about it. Okay, let's actually see what WebAPI MVC actually returns in that call. As you can see, I've made a call there. It's highlighting as red, which means that there's an error. I'm going to go and select that, and we can see that header response. Okay, headers. Do we have a response here? Yeah, response header. We have an error code somewhere. Where is the error code? I can't see an error code.
Status code in general.
Yeah, it's a status code, but where is it?
Oh, it's in general.
It's in general. Yeah, status code is 500, internal server error. But we do have a response. A response contains message. An error has occurred. Very useful error. And then go back. And then it's got exception method, that is our object reference not found, blah blah blah, and it very helpfully pulls the whole stack trace for our users to see exactly where our application failed, which is a really crappy way of handling errors, if you ask me. Okay, what I want to do is I want to wrap this error handling in something easier to manage. Effectively, I don't want to expose the whole call stack to the user. I just want to give a response, but I don't want 500 error, because 500 is a horrible thing. It means the whole server just exploded. I want to put something like bad request or bad gateway or some other error code as a response, and I also want to override this message that MVC puts there by default with just an error message that I'm handling effectively. Right, okay, so, and also what I want to do is I want to implement some user interface stuff, so whenever error occurs, instead of just displaying an alert, I'm going to put some red bar at the top saying there's an error. Right, let's stop that. Alright, say, what I want to do is what I need to do is I'll need to inject an exception handler in my MVC filters. So MVC filters is the whole awesome thing that MVC does. Before any, well, basically you can inject a behavior into MVC itself. So you can inject different routings, you can inject handlers, what it does before the call is made, what it does after the call is made. This is how we actually handle the permissions within Linux.net. You're all familiar with that. So effectively, let's see how it's done. I'm going to go and create a new class on the whole thing. Call it exception handler. Obviously, give it a proper name. Exception handler is not really a good name for an exception handler, believe it or not, because there's already exception handler somewhere in .NET. Okay, it has to inherit from exception filter attribute. Yeah, and we're just going to override on exception function. String content. Okay, and on exception, whenever I see any exception, I'm going to catch it, say screw that, and override it with my own response. So execution, action execution response, I'm going to override it with a new HTTP code, bad request, and a content, I'm going to create just a string where I'm going to output the message, nothing else. I can actually wrap this into more elaborate structure. I can create a class that will kind of represent my exceptions within my application, and say error message is this, it's been called from there, it took such a long time to fail, this is the user, blah, all this kind of stuff I can wrap around in this string content. And also here I can do my logging, so I can send logs to big thing where logs are kept. Okay, and so there I can actually do some logging, I can do some handling with in terms of the workflow data, backtracking, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so now I implemented that. I need to do something else. I forgot what. Yes, I need to add this filter into the web config as well. Well, not web config, web API config. So in my web API config class, I have HTTP configuration config, and this is where we can inject things. So this is where we can inject how we handle permissions, who's got authorizations and things like that. We're going to look at the authorizations in the next session. For the time being, we're just going to go and inject this newly created exception handler into the filters. So whenever there is an exception, it will hit our exception handler there. Let's set a breakpoint there. Execute it. Now we still have that null reference exception in there. Can I? Yes, I can. I have 5. Alright, now it hits it. And it... Alright, now I have 10. Okay, so I'm capturing this, just step through it, created a new response, and I'm just going to execute it, to be honest. Just go through it. Now we've got different error code, 400, which is good. And if we go into my communication, in developer mode, let's look at the communication. Yes, I know you will fail on object reference not found. Okay, get locations, and now instead of this horrible response with all these things, or call stack and our database connection strings exposed and things like that, we just have a very nice output called object reference not found. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take this message and display it to the user instead of this alert that says error code 400. Okay, we can do that by, first of all, we need to make changes in the API services, and when we have an error, so on success we're doing this thing, when we have error we're doing this thing. So in the error we're going to set results as to nothing. Has error will have a true, and error itself will have status. So instead of this status, I'm going to just output data, because that's the content of our data. Do the same thing here, data or data or both, and that's about it. Now on the main controller, right? So when I have this, when I receive this data in the alert, error get locations, and now event error will have a proper error message. I'll reference exception. Ta-da! Error getting locations, object reference not set to an instance on object. Scrappy error message, but still, there you go. At least we have something. So instead of displaying an alert, what I want to show you is how you can inject a what do you call them? It's basically global methods into your API. Well, not API, into your application in AngularJS, which will allow us to have this error message being displayed at the top there instead of, you know, and you can handle this throughout the whole application very easily. Okay, so what I'm going to do is in the application itself, I want to create a method that I have access from everywhere, effectively, from all the controllers, that I can just set, similar to what I do with setBusy, but within that method I want to set a variable called, I have an error within the scope, so that my user interface can just very easily generate that error message. Anyway, I think if I actually do this, it will make more sense. Okay, so let's just copy this code here. I'm going to walk you through what it does. Okay, up, run, if you think about it, is the same as a main method in .NET application, right? It just declares a function that gets, you know, basically executes when the application runs. So I can put any stuff, pre-configuration stuff into my application in this run method. Within that run method, within the root scope, it actually takes a root scope. There's different levels of scope in the AngularJS. Again, we're not going through the AngularJS structure. All you need to know is that when you run things, it takes a root scope. Within the root scope, I'm taking the actual scope and declaring a variable, a property, variable, class, whatever, called error message, and is error, setting that to false, and then I'll declare a function called setError. And that setError will take a error message and will set this error message, well, root scope is error to true, and we'll set the actual error message that we specified, and after 300 milliseconds, it'll hide it. Well, it'll set it back to false, basically. Okay? And now, let's make some changes to our UI. I'm going to put this div on our main HTML page. Still going to be within our controller, right there. And basically, this is a div that will show, ng-show, only in the event where root scope, well, scope variable is error equals true. So when we actually set, when we call this setError and provide an error message within the scope, is error will be set to true, and this div will actually show on the user interface through wonderful AngularJS binding. We don't have to worry about that. And that's it. It's just going to display this thing. When it's set to false, it'll hide it. Now in the main controller, instead of setting this alert, what I can do is I can say, okay, scope. In this run method, we declared the fact that scope will have a setError function, method, class, whatever you call this in JavaScript. I don't know anymore. Event. What's the event? Error? Yes. Okay. So instead of showing an alert, now I'm going to, in the scope, we'll set an error and then the error message. Execute it to see if it actually works. Ta-ding. Yay! And it disappears after 3 seconds. Let's do it again. It's there. It's not there. Okay, of course we can code different functionality in terms of how we show this error message, then we want really user to acknowledge it, maybe show the next error message and so on. But that's that, you know, the idea is there. The fact that you can handle all of this, you know, behavior in terms of how this error message is actually being shown in that set error message. That's it. Any questions?